Hello to the internet and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am filming at a different angle, I guess you could say, or just in a different place because in my video last time with my reaction to The Grinning Man, it wasn't until I was editing that I realized, oh, in the background is my giant air conditioner that I can't move because it has to have the big plastic tube thing in it that stays in the window. And so that wasn't a very pretty background. I am just sitting at my desk now. My desk is right next to me on this side, but you can't see that right now. But anyway, we have my pretty bed in the background with the little white canopy thingy and my phantom photos. I have more of them, but I haven't hung them up because when I first moved into this apartment 2 years ago, I was hanging them up happily and there was a knock from the other side of the wall. So apparently my neighbor does not like hearing nails driven into the wall. So maybe someday I will hang up the rest eventually, whenever that is. But anyway, I wanted to make this video today to answer the question that is posed to all the members of the collaborative Pagan Perspective YouTube channel. I've been subscribed to them for a while. I subscribed to them originally with my first YouTube channel, Theta Raven, and then once I started my author platform channel, which is this channel, I subscribed to them with that channel. So I've been subscribed to them for a long time. They're a great channel that bring together all kinds of people from the pagan witchcraft community to answer questions that are posed by us, the YouTube audience, once a week. So I thought, even though I'm not officially a part of that channel, that I would start answering the questions along with them, just to give my thoughts as I am a practicing eclectic pagan myself. And also I figured it'll get me in the habit of posting more regularly and will give me topics to answer because I'm still trying to find my voice as a YouTuber, which is a little difficult. It's much more difficult than it appears because even though ideally it's, oh, just be yourself and talk to the camera, that's a lot more difficult than it appears to be. It sort of reminds me a lot of being a writer and sharing your work in class as opposed to being a performer and sharing someone else's work through you. I'll never forget when I was in college and we had my first poetry class. It was the first time I had to read a poem that I had written in front of the class. And I thought, oh, well, since I'm in theater, that'll be a piece of cake. I can speak in front of an audience, no problem. But as I walked up to the front of the room and prepared to read it, it was absolutely terrifying. I was gripped by not even stage fright because it wasn't the being in front of people that I was uncomfortable with. It was the I'm sharing a piece of my soul in front of an audience that isn't being protected or masked by a character. Because it's one thing as an actor or actress to show and channel your own emotions through the guise of a character, but when you're up on stage sharing your own work, a little piece of yourself that is from your own voice, yeah, that's really scary. I mean, it's no wonder that a common nightmare that people have is being completely naked on stage with all the bright lights and just being absolutely, just having no shield of protection, being literally and metaphorically naked on stage. Presenting yourself, your authentic self, to the world, to the internet, and deceiving yourself, but also not rambling. It's a tightrope walk, and one that I'm still learning to walk myself, so please bear with me, audience, and thank you for your patience. And so with that, we will get to the question that was posed this week to the Pagan Perspective YouTube channel. And the question was, what are some of your pagan role models? They can be characters from fiction, they can be historical figures, they can even be people who may not necessarily identify as pagan themselves, but who, from our perspective, help the pagan community or do good for the earth in some way, which is central to the faith of being a pagan. And so this is just going to be my list off the top of my head, and a lot of these people will overlap into who my heroes and heroines are as a writer and as someone involved in theater. So with that, I'll first start with real life people. And also, if you hear a voice from the next room, that's my sister Heather. She is doing a Periscope right now. We're both filming at the same time, so if there's a little bit of an overlap with sound, that's why. But yes, pagan role models, and first starting with historical figures. First, I would have to say Joan of Arc, and obviously she herself did not identify as a pagan, but I absolutely believe that Joan had a little bit of the pagan spirit or witchy spirit in her, because her faith, her personal faith took a lot of influence and inspiration from the pagan ways. She spent a lot of time out in nature. She connected with the divine, with the voices that spoke to her through being out in nature in her father's garden, by an old ancient tree that had been there for ages, by I think there was also a well in the garden that she would spend a lot of time near, and that's where the voices first came to her. Joan also was completely fearless in battle and her beliefs. She went out into the fray, not caring that most women of her time were expected to either settle down and marry or go live in the convent. She followed her voices that told her, you're meant for greater things. Not that there isn't greatness in being a wife and mother or going to be a nun if that's your calling, but it also shouldn't be said that those are the only roles women can do. And Joan absolutely embodied that spirit of doing what feels right to you and following the divine as it speaks to you, not caring what priests or churches or organized religion has to say, even though Joan followed her Catholic faith and adhered to the structure as it fit her, but she also didn't bend or bow down to the dogmatic rules that didn't fit her path or that tried to conform her into something that she knew she wasn't. She relied on the ancient myth of the maiden coming from the woods, the strong warrior girl coming out of the forest and leading her people, which if that's not pagan, I don't know what is. So yeah, Joan of Arc has always been a hero of mine ever since I was little. I don't know if any of you remember the 90s TV show Wishbone that chronicled different classics, different stories with a cute little puppy dog inserting himself into the stories, but one of the episodes featured the story of Joan of Arc as was told by Mark Twain, and I had that episode on a VHS, and I would run around my living room at 7 years old I would get a towel or a pillowcase and tie it around my neck for a cape, and get a dully sharpened pencil, and I would run around my living room pretending that I was Joan. So she's been a hero of mine as far back as I can remember. I've always loved her story. Another hero of mine is Dr. Jane Goodall, who is a woman who has spent decades studying chimpanzees in Africa, and she works for the conservation of not just chimpanzees but for all living things. And again, she's been someone I've looked up to since I was little. I first heard about her in a newspaper article when I was about 8, and I've adored her ever since. She is just a wonderful role model. Again, another strong woman who blazed her own trail at a time when women weren't expected to be scientists and to venture off on their own, certainly not into the wilds of Africa by themselves. And Jane did. She went in the 1960s. She was sent out there by Dr. Louis Leakey, who hired her specifically because she didn't have any university degrees. He wanted someone who, in his words, had a mind that was uncluttered by scientific theory. So he sent Jane out into the Gombe Stream Reserve to study the chimpanzees, and she broke a lot of scientific records, both in her observations and in her methods. She named her subjects instead of numbering them. She recognized that chimpanzees have personalities and show emotions just as humans do, and at the time that was revolutionary for studying animal behavior. Scientists didn't want to attribute personalities and emotions and those sorts of individual traits to their animal subjects because they thought, well, we don't want to anthropomorphize them. We don't want to give them human personalities and traits when they might not have those things. And Dr. Jane Goodall is just absolutely amazing. Look up, you can Google her, all the accomplishments she's done. She just cares so much for the earth and for all its creatures. She travels and lectures and works about 300 days out of the year, and she's in her 80s now, which is amazing. May we all do as well. She just absolutely wonderful, wonderful figure. I'm not sure what her spiritual beliefs are, but she seems pretty eclectic from what I can tell. She draws from a lot of spiritual traditions, and so yeah, she's definitely a wonderful person to look up to, whether you're pagan or just if you care about the earth. Wonderful role model. My third historical figure I would have to say is Eartha Kitt. She just incredible. Eartha Kitt was an actress, a cabaret singer, an author. She survived just a horrific childhood of abandonment and abuse. Her mother basically left her with, I don't know if it was friends of the family or just a family of strangers, but her mother basically abandoned her because she wanted to remarry a man who didn't want Eartha in the family because Eartha was of mixed heritage. Eartha grew up with horrific abuse by the family that took her in. That's not even the right term, who basically she was left with. But she survived. She then went to live with an aunt who also treated her very poorly, but Eartha survived. She became a dancer and traveled with the Catherine Dunham Dance Company. She became a cabaret singer. She learned to speak several languages. And when I first encountered Eartha, I was about 13, and I first encountered her with the film The Emperor's New Groove. She was the voice of Yzma, who was the villain in the story, but I gravitated to her immediately. Here was this character she worked with magic, she worked with potions, she was a sorceress, she was far more intelligent than the ruler who she was forced to work under, this bratty, snotty, selfish, young teenage kid who basically was just in it for himself. And granted, Yzma was too, but you could just tell that she was shaped to work for herself and to seek things out for herself because she was stuck under the thumb of this bratty emperor. And so if she had been made to rule, maybe she would have maybe things would have worked out better. She basically was just such a strong character, and yet here she was in this bit part of the villain, of being seen as the bad guy. And that's even more clear if you know the history of The Emperor's New Groove. It was originally going to be this film called Kingdom of the Sun, directed by Roger Allers, who directed The Lion King, and it was going to be this big, epic film that delved into Incan mythology with their gods, and Yzma had a much larger role. She was going to be a central figure to the story, and it seemed like a much more epic film, and a film that wouldn't date as quickly as The Emperor's New Groove has. That film, you can definitely tell it was made in the 2000s, and that it was made by a company that was trying to imitate the 1940s Warner Brothers style of storytelling and animation, but it just hasn't aged well as a Disney film, I don't think. But Yzma stood out to me, and from there I bought a lot of Eartha Kitt's CDs, and I read several of her autobiographies, and her story is just absolutely fantastic. Just all the things she survived, all the things she accomplished. What struck me as a young girl is just that she radiated out confidence. She still found it within herself to embrace who she was as a woman and to radiate out that spirit of, I know I'm a sexual being and I can be sexy not just for the partners in my life, but for myself. It feels good to know that I have sensuality and sexuality in me. It feels good to embrace the inner tigress in me, the inner divine feminine who just loves pleasure and just sensuality, and not just in the sense of sex, but just embracing the physical pleasures of life. Good food, good company with good friends, a good glass of wine, just knowing who you are as a person and embracing your likes, just basically following the Wiccan Rede. And it harm none, do what you will. To me, Eartha was definitely a witch. She even has a great song called I'd Rather Be Burned as a Witch, which basically sums up, yeah, I'd rather live my life as it is, even if that means getting burned by society or being looked at as a witch in a negative sense, than not living my life at all. So I adore Eartha. She actually answered a fan letter I sent to her when I was, again, about 13. I wrote a fan fiction to The Emperor's New Groove, a sequel to it that focused on Yzma and made her the central figure. It was a very dark story looking back on it. It dealt with Yzma using the incoming colonial powers to assert power for herself, so I wouldn't have had it go that route if I rewrote the story again, but I wrote it and sent it to Eartha. She sent me a letter in reply encouraging me to continue my writing. Of course, then Disney went on to make Kronk's New Groove, which I've not seen. I refused to see it on principle because I wrote to Disney saying, hey, I've written the sequel, and they answered me back and they said, oh, that's great, but Disney doesn't accept outside sources or outside ideas for movies, which is hysterical considering most of their movies are already adapted from fairy tales and sources that already exist. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent just to, oh, Disney, it has its issues. But anyway, Eartha Kitt, wonderful lady, absolutely fantastic, great role model, just a wonderfully strong person. She embodied the feminine divine in all her aspects, the maiden, the mother, the crone, just everything. So hats off to you, Eartha. Love you. Another historical figure I look up to as a pagan is Victor Hugo. And again, he's one of those historical figures who, although he himself might not have used the term pagan because in his time it would have had negative connotations, I absolutely believe that Victor Hugo was a pagan in spirit, if not in the words that he used, because, well, actually in the words that he used in a lot of his stories, there are a lot of pagan and esoteric themes that a lot of adaptations tend to ignore, because, well, that's what happens a lot with adapting classic literature into film, or even just reading it. People tend to view it through a Judeo-Christian lens, because there's the assumption of, well, this was in the 1800s, and so obviously Christianity was the norm, the dominant religion, and so everybody must have been Christian and looked at the world through Christian eyes. And while Victor Hugo definitely expresses Judeo-Christian perspectives in his writing, there are also a lot of pagan themes in his work, and that reflects Victor Hugo's life. When he was a young man, he was very firmly a Catholic, and he adored the Pope. I think he even wrote a couple of poems about how much he loved the then current Pope and the church and all that. But as he got older, his beliefs changed. to the point where he became very critical of the church. That's what his novel Notre Dame de Paris, which was published as The Hunchback of Notre Dame in English, that's what the focus of the novel is. Aside from its first point, which was Victor Hugo wrote it to save Notre Dame, which at that time was in such bad disrepair, there were talks of tearing it down, and Victor Hugo adored the building, adored the architecture of the church, and so he wrote Notre Dame de Paris to call attention to it, and that's why Notre Dame is still in Paris today. But also, along with advocating for the historical preservation of the building itself, Victor Hugo was very critical of the church, and that's illustrated through the character of Dom Claude Frollo, who is the archdeacon of the church, but secretly he's an apostate. He is an alchemist. He has a secret laboratory that he practices alchemy in, which at that time in the 1400s was not a very good thing to do. Alchemy had started to fall out of fashion and started to have all the negative connotations that witchcraft and alchemy basically took on, even though in years and centuries past it was seen as sort of an exotic hip thing to do according to the nobles. But anyway, so Claude Frollo is secretly an alchemist and basically what the church would consider a wolf in sheep's clothing, even though he's, from what I recall, not that bad of a guy. Initially, he adopted baby Quasimodo out of genuine pity and wanting to take him in, as opposed to the more villainous reasons that other adaptations might have given him. Again, looking at you, Disney. The book basically boils down to, hey, if Frollo hadn't had to squish his brain into the dogma of the church, maybe he wouldn't have gone so completely crazy and become the villain. So that was Victor Hugo's criticism of the church. And also in his other book, L'Homme qui rit, The Man Who Laughs. Please forgive me for my terrible French. I do not speak French. Took a year of it in college, but that's pretty much it. In The Man Who Laughs, Victor Hugo's pagan roots or pagan beliefs come out even more so. One of the characters is named Dea, which means goddess in Latin. There's a lot of imagery of goddesses, of the divine being in nature, of people being able to connect to the divine without the need for churches, for organized religion, for priests. The idea that anyone can connect to the divine. The idea that the divine can be found in theater, such as in the play performed by our trio of heroes, Ursus, a gruff philosopher, Gwynplaine, a clown who was scarred with a Glasgow smile as a child, so the only role he really can play is a clown, and Dea, who assumes the role of various goddesses throughout the play. That's one of Victor Hugo's lesser known works, so if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I also recommend the 1928 silent film adaptation. For a film, especially a silent film, it captures the book pretty well. It changes the ending to make it a little bit more happy than the original novel ending, but it's the best adaptation that's been done so far on film, I think. So Victor Hugo, definitely one of my idols as a pagan and as a writer myself. Another author I look up to, Edgar Allan Poe. His writing he did wonderful shadow work, which shadow work, if you don't know, is looking at the darker side of humanity and your own darker side and not seeing those things as purely malevolent in the way that a Judeo-Christian worldview might present, in the sense of, oh, there's only good or only evil, and there's that black and white contrast of something's either all good or all bad. But it's acknowledging that we all have a dark side and the light won't shine unless we confront that, and that light can't shine without shadows. So Edgar Allan Poe's writings and stories definitely show that, but he also shows that the light is always there. He adored nature. He sought the divine in nature. He sought pure beauty in nature. He recognized that nature was one of the few things in life that, for all its changes with the seasons, its constant beauty and the lessons it can teach are always there. and fantastic writer. My favorite works of his are The Raven and Annabel Lee, The Telltale Heart. I could talk about Poe for hours. I adore him. I first came across his work when I was 9 years old in 4th grade. My teacher had a cassette tape. Yes, a cassette tape. I'm dating myself. My 4th grade teacher had a cassette tape that had spooky Halloween songs and stories on it, and one of those things was a man reading The Telltale Heart, and I don't know what the man's name was, but if I ever heard that rendition again, I would recognize it immediately because it scared the shit out of me, and I slept with the lights on in my room for at least a week, and I've loved Poe ever since. So thank you, Mr. McFadden, for introducing me to Poe and for scaring me to pieces with that initial introduction. And the final few historical figures I can think of who influenced me are Larina McKenith, S.J. Tucker, and Heather Dale. And for those of you in the pagan community already, they need no introduction, but for those of you who don't know, those three are musicians whose music infuse a lot of pagan and witchcraft themes in their work. Larina McKenith got me into paganism because I first heard her song The Mystic's Dream in the miniseries of The Mists of Avalon, which that story got me into paganism. We watched a little bit of it in my 12th grade English class when we were doing a unit on the Arthurian legends, and I was so captivated by it I looked it up online and found through the IMDb message boards of it that paganism, modern paganism, was a thing. At first I honestly thought, when I saw messages titled, "What are your patron deities?" and things about Wicca, I honestly thought that they were fan fiction. And it was through reading them that, oh, people actually believe these things and that paganism didn't die out with Christianity taking over Europe and taking over the Western civilization, basically. The Mists of Avalon, I will always owe my path to that miniseries and later the book, even if its author had some pretty dark allegations come out about her after her death, but I will always love that story. And so I guess then the book's author, Marion Zimmer Bradley, I could add to my list as a writer, if not a person. But yeah, Larina McKenith, love her work. S.J. Tucker, adore her. Her music is awesome. Heather Dale, love her Arthurian songs. And Dav the Bard, also another great pagan artist. Another figure I love and look up to, even though she obviously wasn't a pagan, but I look up to her for her use of the written language as a way of finding peace and of holding on to faith in humanity. Anne Frank, I absolutely adore her. She's another great role model as a writer and just as a decent human being. She, in spite of all she went through, she believed that people are genuinely good at heart, so I love her also. And now moving on to figures in literature I look up to, or in pop culture that I look up to as a pagan. Firstly, I would have to say Eric, who is the man who became known as the Phantom of the Opera. And I also could have included him in the historical figures category because in the original book by Gaston Leroux, the very first line is, "The opera ghost really existed." And Gaston Leroux, apparently, those were also his last words, "The opera ghost really existed." According to Leroux himself, he was inspired to write the book after he was accompanying some workers who were excavating the cellars of the Garnier Opera House, and they found a skeleton that had a gold ring on its finger, and it was presumed that that was Eric's skeleton, according to Gaston Leroux. Some say Eric really existed, some say Gaston Leroux just made him up and went and kept up the idea of, no, he was real, as sort of a marketing scheme. But I think that Eric did exist because there's threads of historical evidence to support it, which you can go look up for yourselves. Eric is definitely one of my fictional heroes, even though he does go down a dark path. I've always admired him for embracing the cards that were dealt him. My favorite line from the book says, "He had a heart that could have held the empire of the world, yet in the end he had to content himself with a cellar." And Eric did create a little home for himself in the lower realms of the Paris Opera House with furniture, and he created music down there. He basically did his best to live as normal, quote-unquote normal, a life as he could. And even though he went to extremes to try and achieve that, his willingness and his attitude of, I'm a human and I deserve happiness and companionship the way any other human does. I've always admired that. It's why I've never really liked adaptations that focus just on the love triangle of the story, because to me the story is much more than just a sappy, melodramatic love triangle. It's about Eric as an individual, not just how he relates to being a third of the love triangle. But I could talk about that for hours, so I won't go too much more into that. Eric is definitely one of the characters I look up to. Another I would have to say is Gwyn from The Man Who Laughs. He's similar to Eric, and he's a disfigured character who was dealt a rough hand, but unlike Eric, he doesn't let that make him bitter. He believes in the goodness of humanity. He wears his heart on his sleeve. He just does everything he can, even in his meager circumstances of being a clown, to help people, to speak up for the people in the audience who can't speak for themselves. He also strives for true love at any and all other costs, and I love him. I actually work with Gwynplaine a lot in pop magic, which, for those of you who don't know, a lot of pagans don't work just with traditional deities from pantheons. We sometimes adopt fictional characters or people into the energies and the people we call upon to work with to help us in our magic, and Gwynplaine is definitely one of those figures. Dea too, also. And Victor Hugo himself. And going into the Arthurian circle, Marlin, of course. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a pagan who wasn't inspired by, or at least knows of Marlin, the ancient sage who helped King Arthur, and Morgan Le Fay, but as she's portrayed in The Mists of Avalon, as a misunderstood priestess of the old ways, not as the straight-up villain that a lot of the traditional tellings paint her to be. Because her character shows there's two sides to every story, and in the medieval text of the Arthurian legends, there's no real clear-cut, oh, Arthur's the hero and Morgan's the villain, or vice versa. It's just, here are these two stories, and over time people assumed Morgan was the villain because, oh, she's an unruly woman, and of course then she must be evil. And lastly, off the top of my head, and I say this with the greatest humility, but the characters I'm working with in my own novel series I'm creating right now, the novel series Splintered Spirits, because many of the characters are witches. 4 of them are the daughters of an alchemist, and they're all named after gemstones. The names of the gemstones, as they're called in French, there's Rubus, Emerald, Sapphire, and Opal. And so I look up to them because just from writing their stories and working with the energies of their gemstones, and that how I've had them correlate with different elements based on their zodiac signs and working with their elements, just they've helped me on my journey, not just with writing them, but as a person. They've really helped me look at myself as a person, as a pagan. I think a lot of artists can attest to that. When in the process of creation, your characters and stories really hold you yourself accountable as a creator and as a person, and they make you see sides of yourself that you might not have seen before because you're looking at things from from their perspective. And obviously not all characters are just the writer putting a mask on themselves, but characters are people with all facets, and a writer may have to write a character whose perspective and outlook on life is completely different from their own. So yeah, my girls, I look up to them a lot. I also look up to their father in the story, Professor Neville, and all the characters that the girls end up helping, because the basic premise of the story is their father sends them out to help people, to save them from either self-destruction or outside influences, hence the name of the book, Splintered Spirits. But it also has a double meaning in its name, but you'll find that out once the books come out. And also, with that in mind, I look up to my co-creator, Anton Salbean. The premise of the series was his idea, and he asked me to write the books with him, so our girls wouldn't be coming through into the world without his help, without him asking me to go on this creative journey with him. Those are the fictional and also some more historical figures I look up to as a pagan. Who are some of yours, if you're also a pagan, or whatever your spiritual path is? Who are people that you look up to as a follower of whatever path you follow? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're new here to the channel, welcome, and feel free to subscribe. Hit the subscribe button and also click the bell to get notifications about when I post. And also the links to my other socials will be in the description below. Thank you for watching, and blessed be.